What kind of soul is born in the middle of screaming, heavy silence, and unspoken guilt that lingers like dust in a house no one cleans anymore? What kind of child survives in a place where love is handed out like a debt, where stares cut deeper than words, and affection is rationed, like it might run out? It's not an easy question, but it's a necessary one. Because some people are born into homes where growing up feels more like surviving, where childhood isn't a refuge, it's a minefield, where every step is taken in fear, but still taken. And somewhere in those shaky steps, something begins to form. Something stronger than anyone expected. Something that not even emotional violence, emotional neglect, or systematic rejection can completely break. An invisible root that doesn't show itself in the early years, but that, sooner or later, starts pushing upward, toward the light. Most people never see that process. They just see the adult, strong, wise, resilient, without ever imagining the cost. They don't picture the nights when the soul almost gave up, the tears that had to be swallowed behind a closed door or into a bitten pillow. People admire strength without asking where it came from, as if it showed up out of nowhere, as if it wasn't the direct result of walking through hell and still holding on to the ability to feel. Carl Jung never explicitly said that strong souls are born in toxic families. But if you read between the lines of his thoughts, his reflections on the shadow, individuation, and suffering, you'll feel the idea echo loud and clear. Not as a blunt statement, but as a quiet revelation. Sometimes, the places that tried to destroy us are the same places that woke us up. Yes, it's true. Many people who grow up in hostile environments go on to repeat the cycle. They become abusers. They shut down. They get lost. But others, through what can only be called a kind of miracle, choose a different path. The path of those who don't run from their pain, but transform it. Who don't hide their wounds, but integrate them. Who don't forget, but refuse to be poisoned by memory. And that path, as lonely and misunderstood as it often is the one that shapes the strongest souls. What happens inside a toxic family is something most people don't want to look at: invisible dynamics that suffocate, unwritten rules that erase, and silences heavier than screams. These are homes where the child learns to adapt to avoid punishment, to stay quiet so they won't be a burden, to please so they won't be left behind. And the worst part is that often, that toxicity comes wrapped in seemingly normal behavior. Parents who say, "It's for your own good," but humiliate you. Mothers who say, "I love you," but manipulate you. Grandparents who repeat, "That's how I was raised," as if that justifies the damage. And still, in the middle of all that darkness, something strange happens. It's as if the soul, unable to find safety on the outside, turns inward. As if the lack of tenderness forces it to invent its own. As if the early abandonment unlocks a force that can't be explained rationally, the strength to be different, the hunger to heal what others chose to ignore, the courage to break what felt unbreakable. And that drive, that hunger for inner freedom, becomes more powerful than the entire family system. More powerful than guilt, fear, or blind obedience. It becomes unstoppable because it's born straight out of pain, and because it doesn't seek revenge, only meaning. Jung spoke of the shadow as the part of ourselves we repress, deny, and bury. But in a toxic family, the shadow isn't just personal, it's inherited, passed down like a silent curse from generation to generation. And the one who dares to face it, to stare at it without blinking, becomes the cycle breaker. Not through words, but through presence. Not through speeches, but through action. That person, without even realizing it, becomes the turning point in an entire family story. But what makes someone take that leap? What pushes them to not repeat the past? Why do some souls drown in bitterness, while others rise with compassion? Maybe it's because pain, when you stop running from it, becomes a teacher. Maybe it's because suffering, when faced without numbing it, shows you things no one else can see. Maybe hitting bottom doesn't always mean sinking. Sometimes it's where we finally find solid ground to build from. The strong souls, the ones who inspire without even knowing it, the ones who love even though they were never loved the way they deserved, aren't strong by luck. They're strong because once, as kids, they felt invisible and made a silent vow never to disappear from themselves. They're strong because they were betrayed by those meant to protect them and still didn't choose hatred. They're strong because they knew their pain wasn't meant to be a chain, but a seed. And even though it burns, even though that kind of growth is brutal, it's also what turns them into beacons. In a world where trauma gets normalized and families are idealized no matter how much harm they've done, talking about this feels almost rebellious. But it's necessary, because so many people still feel guilty for questioning what they went through. They still think being loyal to their parents means betraying themselves. They still justify the unjustifiable in the name of love. And meanwhile, their soul is begging for space, for truth, for light. The process of individuation Jung talked about is, at its core, a kind of rebirth. It's not about breaking away from family out of hate. It's about breaking the mold that's choking you. It's about finally being born as yourself. And that's impossible without walking through the swamp, without looking your childhood wounds in the eye, without letting go of the fantasy that those who hurt you were saints. Because only then, when your inner truth weighs more than outer appearances, can you begin to build a life that isn't just a reaction, but a creation. So yes, maybe strong souls really are born in toxic families. Not because pain is noble, but because, when it's inevitable, it becomes a doorway. And not because suffering always builds character, but because some people, through deep clarity, refuse to become what hurt them. And in that choice, silent, lonely, defiant, there's a strength that no toxic history can hold back. It might not be fair. It might not be easy. But in that same place where many fall, others wake up. And when they do, they don't just save themselves. They begin to heal everything that came before them. As if their soul, born in chaos, always knew it wasn't here to repeat the story, but to transform it. There's a truth most people can't look straight in the eye. Sometimes what hurts the most is what shapes us the most. Not because pain has some kind of built-in virtue, and definitely not because wounds should be romanticized, but because there's a kind of growth that doesn't happen in peace. It happens in tension, in the constant, exhausting strain of a home where affection has to be earned, never freely given. In gestures that cut deeper than insults. In places where the soul learns early on, no one's coming to save you. When you grow up in an environment like that, the first thing you lose isn't joy, it's trust. Trust in others, sure. But more dangerously, trust in yourself. Because kids take what they live as absolute truth. If they're ignored, they believe they don't deserve attention. If they're controlled, they learn freedom is unsafe. If they're punished for feeling, they numb themselves to survive. Slowly, they start to disappear from within. They smile when they're supposed to, obey when it's convenient, and hide the deepest parts of themselves in a place no one can reach. And yet, that place doesn't die. It stays alive. Quiet, yes, but full of questions. Why are they treating me this way? What did I do to deserve this? Where's the love everyone talks about? Those questions sting, but they also ignite. Because when the soul starts looking for answers, even out of confusion, something shifts. It stops settling for survival. It stops accepting the role of passive victim. And it begins, however clumsily, to search for a way out, even if it doesn't know the direction yet. And in that search, people stumble. Because walking away from a toxic family doesn't always mean leaving physically. Sometimes, the hardest part is deprogramming your own mind. Learning that your worth isn't tied to what you do, what you give, or how much you can endure. Learning to stop craving approval. Learning that conflict isn't always a threat. It doesn't always mean you're about to be abandoned. These are deep, invisible wounds. No one can see them from the outside, but they shape every decision, every relationship, every silence. And that's where real transformation begins. Not when everything's okay, but when something inside you screams, I can't keep living like this. When you realize the patterns on repeat, you keep attracting people who make you feel small, carrying guilt that was never yours, living in constant fear of disappointing others. Until one day, something clicks. You're not the problem. It's the emotional legacy you've been carrying. It's your parents' voices speaking through you. It's blind loyalty to a system that broke you. That moment of awakening isn't some grand epiphany. It's messy. It's confusing. It's full of contradictions. But it's real. And that reality is the first step toward freedom. Jung would probably say it's the start of the journey back to the self. A journey not meant to please or conform, but to discover who you really are when you stop just trying to survive. But to move forward, you need the courage to look back. Not with bitterness, but with honesty. To see your parents as they truly were, not as you needed them to be. To recognize their limitations, their emotional ignorance, their unhealed pain. And to understand that even if they hurt you, you don't have to keep passing on that pain. Pain gets inherited, yes, but it can also stop with you. And choosing to stop it is a quiet kind of bravery. It's the soul saying, no more. People who do this aren't perfect. They're not enlightened beings free of contradiction. But they've done something enormous. They've stopped running from themselves. They've stopped reshaping who they are just to be loved. They've stopped pretending it didn't hurt. And in place of all that pretending, they've built something new. Something more honest. More grounded. A kind of presence that doesn't seek revenge, but protection. That doesn't need to destroy the past to build a future, but it does need to understand it. And yes, it hurts. It hurts to realize the love you got came with conditions. That tenderness was rare. That fear showed up more often than safety. It hurts to look at your story and admit that for years, you normalized what was never okay. But it also brings relief, because naming what once was just a fog lifts the weight. You reclaim power, the power to choose who you want to be, without the invisible chains of childhood dragging behind you. Many of the wisest, kindest, strongest people we know have stories like this. Not because life was easy for them, but because they refused to let their pain become someone else's prison. Because they knew what it felt like to grow up cold, and they made the choice not to pass that coldness on. Because they met the dark and realized the soul isn't built by running from it, but by facing it. Jung never said it outright, but his work suggests something deeply sacred about early suffering. If you face it with awareness, it becomes a seed. Not everyone waters that seed. Not everyone wants to look at what hurts. But those who do, those who choose self-awareness over automatic repetition, start writing a different story. Not a perfect one, but a free one. Not without scars, but filled with meaning. And that's more than enough. Because when one person heals, when one person rebuilds themselves with self-love and no longer needs outside validation to feel worthy, they change everything. They break a chain. They close a wound. They become a turning point, not just for themselves, but for generations before and after them. Because the moment they stop being a prisoner of their past, they become a witness to the future. Some people are born to repeat. Others are born to transform. But sometimes, to find out which one you are, you have to hit rock bottom. You have to get lost in the fog of childhood to find clarity in adulthood. You have to live through chaos to find your center. You have to die, symbolically, to who you were, so you can finally become who you're meant to be. And maybe that's why, in the middle of so much pain, there's something sacred. Not because suffering is some kind of gift, but because inside it, a voice is born. A voice you didn't know you had. A voice that doesn't scream, but stands its ground. That doesn't attack, but protects. That doesn't lie, even when it's shaking. That voice that says, I don't have to just survive anymore. Now I get to live. Not everyone who suffers becomes wise. Not every person who grows among ruins ends up building an inner cathedral. But some do. Despite being hurt by the very hands that were supposed to protect them, they don't let bitterness take hold. Somehow, often without even realizing how, they take the broken pieces of their childhood and bring them together, not with glue, but with truth. And from that truth springs something profoundly human, a strength that doesn't need to prove itself, because it's already at peace. That strength isn't obvious at first glance. You won't spot it in how they look, their accomplishments, or any social standing. You sense it in the small moments. In the way someone offers compassion even when they've learned to expect betrayal. In the ability to listen without judgment, even though no one taught them how. In the quiet decision not to respond to violence with more violence. In the kind of love that doesn't demand the other person deserve it, because it comes from a heart that no longer needs validation. Strong souls born from toxic families don't carry that strength as a burden or martyrdom. They carry it because, deep down, they grasp that suffering isn't a destination, it's a passage. They understand they weren't born to replay their past, but to understand, transform, and break free from it. And in that liberation, even if lonely or misunderstood, an echo reaches farther than they ever imagined. Because every time someone breaks the cycle of abandonment, manipulation, or indifference, they do it for more than themselves. For the children who will grow up without fear, for the friends who will no longer be treated like enemies, for relationships that will become sanctuaries instead of battlegrounds. It isn't fair that someone has to grow strong just because there was no other choice. It isn't fair that softness becomes something you have to fight for instead of something you're born with. But that's reality. And denying that only keeps the silence alive. It upholds the unspoken pact so many families cling to, one where you stay quiet so you don't rock the boat, forgive too quickly to keep the peace, and downplay the harm with lines like, "We all have issues," or "No family is perfect," as if that excuses ignoring real pain. But strong souls refuse that. Not because they're better, but because they can no longer ignore what they felt. Because they learned to love truth more than approval. Because one day, whether they realized it or not, they stopped asking permission to heal. They stopped waiting for others to change, and they started changing themselves. And that kind of shift is possibly the most revolutionary act a human can make. Carl Jung spoke of the individuation process, profound, painful, and essential. A path toward wholeness, integration of the shadow, union with your true self. That journey doesn't begin with some grand awakening. It begins with a wound. With the moment something inside you cracks and there's no turning back. With pain you can't numb, memories you can't bury, and the question you can't silence. Who am I beyond what I've lived? Answering that question takes time. Sometimes a lifetime. But every step toward that answer is a declaration of dignity. A statement that you deserve something more. Not because you're special, but because you're human. Because life isn't just a series of internal battles. It's an invitation to truly be, feel, and exist without fear. And yes, it might feel far off. But it's possible, not by magic, but by will. By decision. By the voice inside that says, "I'm not doing this anymore. I want more." Some look back with anger, others with sorrow, and some with compassion. Not naive compassion that justifies everything, but clear-eyed empathy that sees how each generation carries what the last one couldn't face. It sees how parents hurt, even when broken themselves. It recognizes that no one can give what they don't have. But it also sees that doesn't mean you have to stay stuck there. Understanding doesn't mean allowing. Loving doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. When someone frees themselves from a toxic legacy, they're not denying their past. They're choosing to script their own future. And that choice isn't flashy. It doesn't earn applause. It often comes in silent solitude, in the middle of nights alone. But it leaves a mark. Because a soul rebuilt doesn't just shine, it lights the way. Not because it wants to, but because it can no longer live in the dark. It's easy to admire strength once it's fully bloomed. Harder to recognize it when it's still taking root in the mud, when it's still tangled up in rage, anxiety, guilt. But it's there. Even in the darkest moments, something perseveres. Something refuses to quit. Something says there's meaning yet to be found. Call it soul, consciousness, essence. That something is proof that what you experienced didn't break you. That you're still here, breathing, moving, reminding yourself you deserve something better. No one chooses to be born into a toxic family. But some choose not to be defined by it. And that choice, made again and again, day after day, decision after decision, is what builds a strength not born of circumstances, but from the will of a soul that decided to grow anyway. The wound never fully disappears. Time doesn't erase it. Forgiveness doesn't make it vanish. But it can stop hurting. It can become wisdom, clarity, a compass. It can become that part of you that, instead of being a source of shame, reminds you where you came from and why you refused to stay. Because your worth isn't in what you endured, it's in what you did with that endurance. In how you treated yourself afterward. In how you chose to live. And when you realize that something changes, you don't need the world to see you as strong, because you know you are. Not by what you show, but by what you overcame without losing your ability to love. Without losing your tenderness.